Before we work on the doors, let's go ahead and cut the angles on our side walls. And the reason we're doing that now is so that we can reassemble the case to get an idea of how big our doors need to be. So we're going to be removing a majority of the waste on this outside corner on both of these side pieces. So if you kind of look at it from the front, the angle of the doors or the angle of the side walls are going to go like this. And the majority of the waste is removed from this outside corner. So to help us visualize this when we have the pieces disassembled and over at the table saw, we'll just make a line from the inside corner and just draw it toward the outside face. And we're going to take the piece out and do the same thing down here at the bottom, just so if we get the boards mixed up or have to run it a certain way, we'll know how we need to remove the waste. So I've got my blade tilted to 83 degrees for these cuts. And this is where the little line that we drew just a second ago really helps us. Because if you throw the board down, I mean, you're removing the waste from the front edge of the piece, but you'll see that I've got it oriented the wrong way. So what I need to do is flip the board over, look at my reference line, and get that lined up. Now when it comes time to setting the fence, I'm going to sneak up on this because I don't want to remove anything off of the width of this board. But if I remove a 1/16 or an 1/8, I mean, that's fine. I'll just make sure to run both boards at the same fence setting to make sure that they're the same. But I'm going to sneak up on this and remove a little bit until I get it to where it removes the waste but doesn't remove anything off of the width of the board. And for the first pass, I'm just going to push the board in about a couple of inches just to see what I'm working with. And as you can see, I need to move the fence over just a little bit because it wasn't removing enough waste. So with the fence set into place, I can go ahead and run the boards. To measure for the doors, we're going to start from the back of the case. Since this is nice and flat, it doesn't have the angle cut on it like the front does. So we're going to find the length. It's 18. We're going to make a mark right at 9. And then using a combination square, we're going to carry that line to the front of the case. With the straight edge, push it up against the outside wall. And this is set at the angle that we just cut. And this is the outside edge right here, and it's flush down here on this corner. So now we go and see where it lines up with our center line, and it's 8 5/8. But we're not going to be making our doors 8 5/8. We're actually going to be making it a little bit wider than that. So let's go ahead and talk about that. If you've had an opportunity to read the plans, you'll notice that they say the stile should be 3/16 of an inch wider. And that's so that when you put the doors together, they're not going to close, but then you can use a hand plane to make that a perfect fit. So what I plan on doing are to make the outer stiles on both doors 1/8 of an inch wider each. And so when you're modifying the outer stiles, you're going to have to modify the length of your top and the bottom rails. You're going to have to make those 1/8 of an inch longer so that the tenon still goes all the way through the mortises or the bridle joints that we're cutting on the outer stiles. So that's something you're going to need to remember when you cut your stock to length. And speaking of the stock, let's go ahead and cut it to width. I'm going to be using the dimensions that are on the plans, but remember, like I just said, I'm going to make the outer stiles wider 1/8 of an inch each. And to cut the boards to length, I again like to use stop blocks for consistency, and I'm just going to use my miter gauge. And don't forget to make your top and bottom rail 1/8 of an inch longer. I've got the doors laid out in the same orientation in which they're going to be in when they're glued up and installed in the cabinet. So what we're going to do is mark for the mortise and tenons on this just so that we don't mess this up when it comes time to cut the joinery, because you're going to have some pieces like the top and the bottom rail that are going to have both a tenon and a mortise. So we're going to go ahead and label that now so that we don't mess this up later. So in looking at the diagram and the plans, we know that this outer stile is going to have a mortise on both ends. So I'm just going to put an M on top and the bottom. We know that the inner stile is going to have a tenon on both ends. And so I'm going to put T, and I'm going to make sure to move it up just a little bit so that it doesn't get cut off, and T. Now on the top and the bottom rail, they're going to have a mortise. If you're looking at the left door, they're going to have a mortise on the right side and a tenon on the left. So we're going to do T and then M, T and then M. Now we're going to reverse that over here on the right door, and it's going to have a mortise on the left and a tenon on the right. So just change that up when you're marking your pieces. At the table saw, I've switched up my blade and installed a blade that has an FTG, or a flat top grind. And that just means that the top of the blade, it's nice and flat instead of an ATB, which is an alternate top bevel, where each tooth is cut at a different angle. This is going to give me a nice flat bottom on my mortises. So to begin, I've got an auxiliary fence installed. It's roughly 8 inches wide and it's the length of my fence. And I've installed a little right angle guide that's going to ride along this auxiliary fence. And I made sure that the blade is 90 degrees to the auxiliary fence, and this little right angle guide is 90 degrees to the table as well. It's really important to take a few minutes to make sure that's dialed in. Now I've got a sample piece here that's the same exact thickness that I milled up at the same time, and all I'm going to do is set a combination square to roughly under 1/4 inch and make a mark on both sides. And what this is going to allow me to do is set up my fence so that when I cut the mortises, every single piece is going to be cut the same exact way for all of the mortises, because all of our parts are the same exact thickness. And I'm going to be cutting all of the mortises first, and the only thing I'm going to be changing is once I set the fence, I'm going to leave it as is. The only thing that's going to change is the height of the blade, and that's going to be set to the width rather of the pieces that you're going to be fitting into the mortises. So to begin, I'm going to be cutting this sample piece just to make sure that my blade is dialed in and my fence is dialed in as well. So I'm going to line up the right side of my tooth, which is the one closest to the fence, with this line here. And how I'm going to do this is I'm going to run it over the blade, bring it back, flip the piece over, and run it again. That way it's going to give me a centered groove on this piece. With the fence set, I run the piece over the blade, taking my time. It's removing quite a bit of waste, so just take your time and play it safe. Now I'm going to go ahead and rotate the board and put the other face up against the right angle guide and run it over the blade again. This is going to give me that centered mortise that I was talking about. And as you can see, it's got a nice flat bottom and it looks centered, so we're going to go ahead and stay with this setting. The first mortises I'm going to cut are the outer stiles, and I'm going to cut the top mortise first, so that means I need to set the blade height to the width of the top rail. And just so that I don't get this mixed up, when I'm assembling the doors, I'm going to write top, put an arrow, and then come down here, bottom. Next, I set the height of the blade to the width of the bottom rail. And then I cut the bottom mortise on the outer stile. And it's pretty much just repeating this process for the rest of the mortises, setting the blade height to the width of the pieces that have the tenons on them. Now we're going to go ahead and set this up to cut the tenons. And all I'm going to do is make sure to line up the left side of the blade with the left side of this cheek. And I want to make sure that the blade does not go in this groove, but it stops with the edge of that cheek. And again, what we're going to do is run it, flip it, and run it, and hopefully that'll give us a tenon that fits just perfect. So just loosen your fence, tap it up, and that looks good there. And again, we're not going to try to make this a perfect fit right off of the saw. I'm going to be using a rabbiting block plane or a shoulder plane to get this fit dialed in just perfect. So again, using our test piece, I'm actually going to cut this in half so that I can fit this on the other end. So here's the fit. It's a little tight at the bottom, but I'm going to finesse that with my rabbiting block plane. And as you can see, it's flush here and on the back. And I just removed the majority of the cheeks just using a handsaw, but that right there is perfect. To cut the first tenon, I'm going to set the blade height to the outer rail. And this one setting is going to allow me to cut the tenons on both the top and the bottom rail. And by now you should be pretty familiar with how this works. Just run it over the blade, flip it, and then run it again. It's no different from the mortises. I'm just going to set the height of the blade to the width of the pieces and then make my passes. Before removing this cheek, I'm going to cut off a majority of it and leave probably about a little over 1/8 of an inch. And the reason why is the little cheeks have a tendency of just flying off of your table saw when you cut it. So just protect yourself and make this an easier and safer cut by just removing the majority of the waste first. And hang on to these because we're going to use them as clamping pads when we glue this up. I've got my miter gauge set up, and it's going to cut a majority of this waste, but it's going to leave me a little bit of waste that I can clean up using my shoulder plane, just so that I don't cut off too much and create a second shoulder. And I've got a stop block set up so I can cut both pieces. I've got all the parts laid back out where they need to be, and now it's just a matter of doing a test fit on each individual piece and then finessing it with my shoulder plane until it fits just perfect. So the first thing I'm going to do is tackle this one. And just as I was expecting, it needs some work. Let's take my shoulder plane with a really light setting, or at least I thought it was. Go a little bit lighter. And the amount that I take off on one side, I'm going to take that same amount off on the other. It's nice and flush at the bottom, flush on the sides. This is exactly what I want. So I'm going to do the same thing on the rest of them. It took about 20 minutes, but I was able to get the tenons to fit nice and snug using only hand pressure. We're not quite ready to glue this up yet though. We need to take these inner stiles down 1/8 of an inch on the face so that it becomes inset on the top, between the top and the bottom rail. So to do that, you can run it through your planer, take 1/8 of an inch off, but I'm going to take mine through the drum sander because this is some really curly cherry and I don't want to take a chance of it blowing out now with it being pretty much a finished door. One last thing we're going to do is mark the inside edges and then hit those with the hand plane just to clean those up before we glue this together. And we're also going to get this face too. I like to glue the bridle joints up by putting glue on all of the tenons and a little bit in the mortises, but a majority of it goes on the tenons. Make sure you get plenty of glue on all of the tenons as well. And if you get any glue on the faces, just use a damp paper towel or a damp cloth and wipe it off. And another especially important tip when you're gluing these up, make sure that you have the right face on these inner stiles facing out, because remember we took 1/8 of an inch off of these stiles, so make sure it's facing out. I'm going to try to clean up some of the squeeze out before I put it in the clamps because there's quite a bit of it. And then when you're putting clamping pressure on, make sure that the clamp does not go over top of the joint. We want to put it to the side of the joint so that way if the tenon protrudes the mortise, it's not going to stop it from seating all the way. So just put it to the inside of this stile just to get it started. And it should pull itself together. Now remember these little cutoffs from the cheeks on the tenons? We're going to use those right here and put a little clamping pressure on all 4 corners. You want to make sure that there's no glue squeeze out when you're putting these little clamping pads on. So be sure to check that. Otherwise, they won't be coming off, at least very easily. And if you're concerned, you can put a little packing tape on the back side of the little pads. I'm going to move this to the side and clamp up the other door, and I'm going to let them set in the clamps for a couple of hours to let the glue dry.